You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Tiffany Cruikshank. Our podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts, Rachel Land and Katja Bartsch, as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.
We talked about medicine now, and you said, okay, maybe not the emergency aspects of it, but I think what we could also go back to a little bit from having discussed all the medical stuff or all the medical things, maybe bringing it back to those lifestyle decisions too that are not necessarily tied to doctors and the medical world. But I'd love to talk about that too a little bit, like how those placebo effects relate to lifestyle, to yoga, to movement, to how we eat, and all those things. Shall we?
The juicy parts. I love this.
The juicy parts. Yeah. So we define placebos and how you can see them or find them in the medical world. But we already mentioned that placebos occur in other scenarios too, like how you consume your food or how you perceive your exercise to be. And I would like to dig into that a little bit. And I would like to tie it a little bit to your mindset again. Like, it has been shown that your mindset you have about stress, you have about food, and you have about exercise can also create all those expectations and those placebo effects. And I think that's where it really ties into yoga and lifestyle and all of those things. So if we talk about mindset, I mean, what comes to mind immediately, in my opinion, is also your mindset when you're being stressed, right? That's a typical situation where we struggle with our mind. Maybe if we do have stress, how do we cope with that, and how does that lead into the expectation we have about a certain situation? And it's interesting that in those stressful situations, your mindset can have such a big role on how you experience a situation. I mean, it's nothing new, but we do know, for instance, that if you have a quite positive stress management or approach to stress, like if you're calm and composed in a stressful situation, that can actually influence your immune system. So there are studies where they applied a certain rhinovirus, so some sort of cold, some sort of flu, and people who they measured their type of stress management in those studies, and that can influence how many symptoms you get or how bad those symptoms are. So it has to do with mindset again, and with what you expect in a certain situation, and that will be part of how sick you can be. Not always, probably, but like that stress mindset, that stress management you have, and that then ties into meditation and to yoga and to relaxation techniques, because we can alter our stress management and how we deal with stuff like that, and ultimately alter our expectation. And that, I would say, is also a form of placebo effect, not the one with the pill that you typically know of, but one that definitely applies in your day-to-day life.
Well, and I think it's part of the reason why that we have this tendency to kind of see yoga as a cure-all, because of just how impactful that stress response is to so many parts of the body. You know, the immune system being one big mediator of so much in the body, but it's easy to kind of see that. And I think it kind of dumbs down a little bit of what yoga does when we consider it a cure-all, because I think it can be more specific. But I do think there's something to that there really is something there that everyone can probably benefit from, which is why yoga is so become so incredibly popular, which I never would have guessed back in the 90s, but it's great to see.
I mean, it's as you're saying, it's probably one of those more generic topics when we talk about yoga, and there are definitely more specific effects to yoga, but still looking at those kind of specific studies where you can actually measure what your immune system does. And that has to do with your general mindset is still not negligible. And I think we should still keep that in mind, even though it's a more generic aspect of it, maybe. And yeah. And also when it comes to stress, and I think your yoga community can tie into that as well, is how well you're socially supported. So we also know that people who have like a very strong network, that are tied into their families and into circles of friends, that that also has to do with your immune function, and you get less symptoms or fewer symptoms. They do studies like that again, like they administer some sort of flu or cold, and then they see how sick you actually get. It's also a little bit tricky with ethics approval, but there are studies like that. And for many people, I believe that social component of yoga too is important. And we see that how many people crave now to go back to yoga studios and to experience that community. And of course, you don't only have community in yoga, you have it in your family, you have it everywhere. But that's also an important aspect of your mindset and how your expectation is going to form around your overall life and stress and how you perceive a certain situation. So also something we should think about related to yoga and your lifestyle.
Important. Yeah, I know we talk about that a bunch in the mental health training too. And I always loved, I used to love reading about Dr. Dean Ornish's work when it became so popular. I want to say that was like in the late 90s. But he came out with all of the vegetarian diets to try and reverse heart disease, or to reverse heart disease. But I forget, I was trying to find the name of the book, but he had a much lesser known book that came out later that was about how he saw this. What was maybe even more important was their social bonds at predicting outcomes from heart disease too, was looking at their social ties. And I just thought that was so interesting. I thought, like, how are people not talking about this more? And I love that all these things that used to seem so esoteric. Like, I loved the book, The Intention Experiment, which has some pretty loose research in it. It's a really great book though. And, all of that intentional kind of work used to seem so esoteric and fringy. And now we're actually starting to find some real data around that, which, kind of is where we began with the placebo, and, what used to be demonized now being something really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And you're
Sorry,
just
little side note.
Yeah, but the side note perfectly leads us into another kind of mindset topic about food, because you were talking about vegetarian diet. And that's actually one of my favorite aspects when it comes to lifestyle and placebo effects too, is how our mindset about food and also about exercise can change how we perceive taste, how we experience a meal, and also how much we eat. That is really crazy too. Like, just want to mention a couple of studies. There is a lot being done in the realm of marketing. And for instance, there are studies where they put off the labels of beer bottles or wine bottles, and they put other labels on top of them. And you will, if you get a beer bottle that has the label of your favorite beer, and in fact it's a totally different beer, you will love that beer. Even doesn't matter what's in there, you're gonna rate the taste of that beer better.
And soon you won't know anyways. After one or two.
Yeah, it depends on how long the study carries. Exactly. Or if you have a wine bottle and the label says it's from a really good area, like a really high quality wining region, you will also rate that wine bottle to be better and the taste to be better. You will even eat more food that is offered alongside with that. So you will encounter certain triggers in marketing and you will respond to that. When you give kids certain foods and that has a McDonald's label on it, they will say that tastes better, even though it's not McDonald's food. So it's really, it starts
Note to
early
parents,
on.
save the
Note to
labels, bring them
parents.
home, put them on your healthy food. Or I don't know, maybe
Exactly.
I wonder though if they're not trained, if they're not trained, like my sister lives out on a farm like 2 hours from any grocery store and her kids have grown up there. I wonder if, if they might not see McDonald's the same way. Like a part of it is our patterning. Maybe at some point McDonald's won't be considered the good food.
Probably. I mean, it's a conditioned response again. We
Yeah.
talked about conditioning already a little bit, and definitely conditioned response, but yeah.
Yeah.
And also there's one study I definitely want to mention. It has been done in Stanford, I believe, or back in Yale, by Aaliyah Crum, who's also a fascinating researcher. And they offered milkshakes to people, and they put different labels on the same milkshake. One said it's a high calorie milkshake, and the other said it's just a regular milkshake. And the body actually responded differently when they drank the one that had the high calorie one. So it actually produced hormones that indicate that you are filled and that you are saturated. And the body actually responds to a food label and how much you are. We really, as human individuals, we are not immune to that. We respond to that. And I think that's also something, as just consumers, we can maybe be aware of that to some degree, probably not to all of it, but it's definitely an interesting thing to know that your mind is going to respond to that.
I think it's powerful too, because I've worked with a lot of people trying to optimize their health, which is what came, my first book on optimal health. And then my second book, which was Meditate Your Weight, really, if you haven't read it, what you don't realize is it's really about changing your mindset. And not about changing your mindset to losing weight, but about changing your mindset to living healthy and embodying. Like, I think we have these interesting hangups on food being good or bad. And I think there's two sides of this coin. One is, I think what's beautiful right now is people are listening to podcasts and learning more about things. And that's informing that positivity. I'm eating this food, it's good for me. But the other side of it is, I think for me, one thing that's really important when I'm working with people is changing their mindset away from like, I can't have this thing because it's bad for me, or it has too many calories, or, to looking at the benefit of foods, that food really is medicine. So how can I feed myself to feel good rather than deprive myself to lose weight? Because this side, the depriving myself side, only lasts for so long for everyone. But if I can connect to that awareness of what it feels like to be healthy. And I think this is often the biggest challenge in my work with people, especially non-yoga people who maybe haven't done a lot of detoxes, or maybe aren't, as familiar with a lot of the things that I think go around the yoga world a lot more about healthy eating. But people who maybe haven't felt good in their bodies. I think that's the first challenge, is like first just getting someone to notice what it feels like to feel good, because once you do feel good in your body, it is almost like a drug of its own. Like, you want to keep feeling good. And so, it provides that positive feedback to change this framework of what we're going after. Are we trying to deprive ourselves, or are we trying to nourish this positive feeling? Because every food, like I did this recently. I know I'm going a little off topic here, but I did this recently with my husband. He did a therapeutic, I put him on a microbiome, basically, diet to help rebuild his microbiome, which was a really challenging and intensive one. And at some point, like, he has to come off of it. I had to be like, babe, you're done. You need to start eating. But he had this negative view of all these foods that we had taken out. And I said, like, there's a place for everything, every food. Like, there are therapeutic contexts where we might take some things out. Like, yeah, sugar might not be the best thing to eat all the time, but I think there's social situations, and there's times, there's a time and a place for everything. And it's hard because the more we learn, the more we can start to demonize certain foods. And I do think this positivity of this mindset that we're talking about today also applies in a very general way to how we look at so much of our lives and our diet and how we choose to nourish ourselves, and recognizing that I will feel differently maybe, and part of that is dependent on me noticing and having the body awareness to pay attention, which is where I think yoga becomes this baseline of so much that we do in our health and wellness, to be able to reflect and see like, hey, last time I ate that piece of cake, like I took a nap afterwards, like, and I really have a lot of work to get done and I don't want to take a nap. So I'm not going to take it. Or you know what? I just want to hang out with my friends and have a good time. I'm okay taking a nap afterwards today. So I'm going to it's fun. Like that's okay. Like everything serves a purpose. And if I can see that with food or yoga, right? Like we have this in yoga too, this kind of like, this pose is bad for you, doing it this way, or this style is bad. Or, we want to kind of like put a yes or a no or a good or a bad on everything. But I don't think it's that cut and dry. And it requires us to really listen and notice how all of this is impacting us as well. And that our mindset of that is a big part of it.
I also think that positivity that you're referring to is so important. And I just want to add one other study there that I personally was involved with a couple of years ago, that positivity about exercise or how you approach your exercise also has a huge influence. We did a study a couple of years ago where we told some people they were doing fat burning exercise. So they were all doing the same exercise. I think it was 20 minutes or so on a treadmill or on a bike. And the one group we told, oh, that's the fat burning exercise. And the others, we just told it's an endurance exercise. And we primed them accordingly. And then we looked at how much they ate afterwards. So they didn't know that we measured how much they ate, but we measured how much they ate. And there was a difference between people who were so-called self-imposed exercisers. So the people who were doing exercise because they knew it was beneficial and good and rationally had decided or rationally exercise because they know it's good for their health. And the other people who intrinsically are motivated because they enjoy exercise and they think it's fun and they like exercise. And the people who did exercise because they thought it's a good idea, they actually ate a lot more when they did the fat burning exercise. So they kind of gratified themselves. They knew, okay, I'm doing fat burning exercise and maybe coming to exercise for this. And then they actually ate more. So it's a very complicated interwoven thing that happens in your head. But being positive about your exercise, also finding an exercise that you actually enjoy might have an influence in the long term how much you eat after your exercise, and that will have to do with your health. So finding something that you can positively relate to, that is fun and that you're doing because you like it, I think is so essential. And not just to have that checklist with you that fills all the boxes of what you should do, but something you actually enjoy. I think that's so important. And that's also another form of placebo or expectation effect that you have there, and something that shouldn't be discarded.
I'm so happy you said that, because I feel so strongly about that. And in Chinese medicine, it's actually really important too. The liver is considered just to simplify, the stress regulator. And it's so important for the liver in Chinese medicine to have movement you enjoy to help process and regulate that flow of energy through the body, and that ability to mediate stress is such a big thing. And I'm such a huge believer in that. I remember when I was at Nike seeing patients for a long time, I would always have people coming in, and it was this thing that they would say that was very common, like, oh, they were coming in for whatever reason, and like they're running because it's this thing that they like have to do to lose weight or to get back in shape or to get healthy again, and it was a constant conversation. And sometimes you build up a relationship with someone first before you plant seeds like this, but like, I just wanted to be like, hey, you don't have to hate exercise. Like there are so many fun things you can do. It's one of the reasons I love yoga is because there are so many different ways to do it that most people can find something they enjoy. And if not, like go for the hike, go for the run, like ride your bike, play frisbee, whatever it is. But I truly believe I think there's so much to this, finding something you enjoy, much less just that you're going to come back to it again. I don't know about you, but the dreaded, I don't run much anymore. And I really just save it for days when, like, there's some days when I'm like, I just need to go out and like move. There's just like
Hit
nothing,
it.
nothing better than just like going out and running. But I don't consider myself a runner anymore. And most days, like that would not be a fun thing for me to do. It doesn't sound pleasant. And so I don't do it. But I think being able to appreciate that, right? Rather than trying to, it comes back to that, like, we have this infatuation with thinking that health amounts to like depriving ourselves or abusing ourselves in some way, where I really think it's the opposite. I love that research is starting to show us this, that like you can go through the motions of your exercise, but are you really getting everything out of it? And maybe we can flip the coin and find something you actually enjoy. Like make a routine of it because of that, and it has totally different effects, which is so cool. So I'm so glad you brought that up. Thank you for sharing that.
I think it should be one of the main takeaways. Maybe it's really, yeah, it's so essential to enjoy yourself in your body and to find something that you really, really love and have fun with. And anything else, in my personal opinion, nothing to do with research, you won't stick to it anyways, unless you're really someone who likes suffering. Yeah, invest in that time and effort to find that thing that really sparks joy in you in terms of exercise and movement. And I strongly believe there's something out for everyone, and it's so important that we find that.
Yeah, I agree. Oh, so I know you have a few other things that you wanted to mention. What else did you have on your list or
Oh,
in your
well,
mind?
I mean, and just to wrap up, maybe that whole complex of exercise and movement, I just also want to mention that we do have strong research in the field of sports. So for the athletes out there, there are really cool studies too about caffeine intake, for instance, that athletes who got a placebo but thought they were taking or getting caffeine, that they actually improved their performance. And again, it's pure and classical placebo effect. So there are studies out there too that show that receiving a pill, or sometimes also just information actually about your predisposition towards a certain exercise, can improve your performance. That's maybe another one we can close that kind of complex with. A study that showed that if you get information about your genetic predisposition towards a certain form of physical activity, that can influence your performance. So without being true. So people were being told they had a certain predisposition for a certain performance without it being true. They were being lied to. And before and after receiving that information, they did treadmill tests and measured certain athletic performance measures. And when people knew, oh, I got that predisposition towards that type of exercise, they actually got better. So again, if someone's telling you you are talented in that sport, that might have an influence on you. So always just maybe be aware of it too. As an athlete, how your trainer is going to talk to you will have an influence, or may have an influence. You as a trainer or caregiver of a team within an athletic context, be aware how you talk to people. It's kind of coming back to that same thing again. But also I just wanted to mention it, that we do have solid studies in that field too, that just show how important that is.
I love that. This was actually a part of my book too. The meditation one is like, I really believe that people's expectations of us influence us and our own expectations. And I think, when we look at the placebo studies, we see this, we see proof of this too. And I think, one thing for me that's an important takeaway from that is that I really believe that just noticing those patterns can dismantle them to some effect. I mean, those are always happening subconsciously, right? Everyone's expectations, even just like the barista, we're interacting with someone and it's not necessarily in the words that we say, which is part of it, but even our body language and our tone and, the underlying and our, what we think, we might think that our parents expect something from us when they, really like something different. So, I think those expectations that are put on us, or the expectations that we perceive around us and within us, play a really big role in a lot of things in our life, unlocking our potential, holding us back. And I believe that I mean, obviously there's a lot more to this, but I believe a big part of that is just noticing that just the noticing. And this is really, our practice of yoga is a lot of times the noticing is the mechanism. It's not necessarily that we need to, I mean, obviously I'm a huge advocate for talk therapy and a lot of other things that can be helpful for this. But I think the noticing is a big part of dissolving that and shifting that pattern. But being able to notice that, it's like it's happening all the time. It's always there.
Yeah. And maybe to really come to a close and to tie something in for the yoga teachers among us, especially, that noticing that kind of goes into self-reflection and noticing how you yourself have expectations of your students, that can also be something really important. In education, we speak about an effect that's called the Rosenthal or Pygmalion effect. And that's when a teacher will alter their own way of dealing with a person, depending on what they expect from that person. And what flows into that is how well the student performs, but also how they look and what their ethnical background is, and all of these things. And we form so many things unconsciously. We don't even know about them, and they will still affect on how we act towards students, or how we perceive them at least. And that then becomes a cycle, as you were just mentioning. And I just think it's also important for us as yoga teachers to notice, to self-reflect, and to really establish that, and to practice that type of self-reflection. And it's maybe if you're running from class to class and you have a full schedule of 20 classes a week or whatnot, if you're a full-time yoga teacher, it's really an intense thing to do. But in other disciplines, you always have that sort of, in psychology, for instance, you always have that sort of reflection with peers or with mentors. And it's just something I think we should also be aware of as yoga teachers, that noticing what we expect from our students, that will influence our relationship with them. And that ties into so many things that we talked about how we're going to communicate with them, how we're going to be warm towards them, and all of these things, and how that student is going to perceive our relationship with them. And that's also something that's so important.
Yeah, I love that too. And I think it's one of the reasons why I really believe meditation is kind of like the groundwork of what we do as yoga teachers. It keeps coming back to our own practice. And it doesn't necessarily have to be meditation, but meditation is such a great platform for self-study and reflection, which the asana practice can be as well. I remember it reminded me of a time a while back when I still loved teaching arm balances and inversions and these really challenging classes, which I think holds a really important place in the yoga practice still. I don't teach it much, or my practice has evolved a lot since then. And so it's a little different, but at the time it was really important to me. And I remember thinking why aren't I really want them to like learn how to relax into it. I want there to be this, the intensity, but being able to find that sense of ease in it. And, as I, reflect back too, there wasn't that expectation within me either, the way I was teaching. And I really think, this shows up a lot in a restorative practice too. If you're teaching more introspective practices or yin or meditation, for me, what's really important is being able to embody that experience, being so familiar with these practices in my body that I can feel that place inside of me and teach from that. And I think it was the same thing back then. It's a lot harder to do, when you're teaching handstands and arm balances is like, and I think that's kind of one of the big learning tools there too, is can I approach these really challenging circumstances with equanimity, with ease, which is a lot easier said than done. But, reflecting back on it too, I think a lot of it was in my demeanor of how I was teaching it and what I was expecting. And we all do that. It's not like I failed as a teacher. I think it was what it was at the time, and we all learn and grow. And as you take in this information, I think it's important to bookmark it in your mind, but also not be hard on yourself, because as humans and as teachers, our dedication is to the process, is to continuing to learn, to continuing to grow, to continuing to improve ourselves, whether that means showing up as a compassionate parent, right, and caretaker, or listening to my partner, or it means showing up as an empathetic yoga teacher, or someone at your workplace, for someone at your workplace. I think this shows up in pretty much all parts of our lives, but it's something that we can constantly refine and be conscious of how much is influencing these outcomes in our experience, as well as conditions. And now, one thing I did want to mention, and because that really feels like a great place to close things, but I did want to mention that there are some drawbacks, because even just like yoga, the placebo is not a cure-all. And I think my understanding of it, and I'd love to hear your side of it, is that, obviously placebo can be really great for subjective experiences. And for some there are definitely some physiological changes that happen as well. But for instance, I forget where this is from, but I remember reading a long time ago some research around people training at altitude and giving them fake oxygen. And for instance, it didn't change their oxygen levels, but it did change their subjective experience. Like, for instance, for a diabetic or someone with a very clear medical condition, it's not going to cure the diabetes, but it might change some of the subjective experiences. So even though there are some very real physiological changes happening here, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to cure the initial instigator potentially, right? I think there's a lot to this, but it's not the cure-all.
No, there's definitely limitations, and we mentioned a couple of them. Like, you should never go off your meds if you're on a really life-threatening condition, and just play with
or
that.
Any meds,
any
without
meds
your doctor,
without your doctor,
but especially
of
those,
course.
yes.
Yeah, but definitely there I found a nice summary of that, and it said like, a placebo contraceptive is not going to prevent you from getting pregnant.
Don't use this as birth control. Thank you.
And placebo antibiotics are also not going to kill bacteria. So there are definitely limitations to that. And although we did discuss a lot of implications also for our daily lives, we definitely need to keep that in mind. And I think that's very important. And I do love that you summed it up with the point before, that we have to bring, or we should bring a lot of empathy towards ourselves, and all that compassion that we see has a lot of influence and a lot of impact on your experience, that also goes towards yourselves. But never forget that there are limitations to this, and that there are conditions where the mindset is part of it, and it's a valid part of it, but it's not everything. So definitely something that should be said to close this conversation.
I love that you mentioned the antibiotics too, because it does have an effect on the immune system, right? And so there is a lot of gray area here too. I know there was one book I read a long time ago. I don't even really remember the details of it, but Anatomy of an Illness by Norman Cousins is such a good one. He has, I'm pretty sure, I forget exactly what his diagnosis was, but he had, I think, some form of terminal cancer, and he was in the hospital and basically walled himself off from everyone and brought in like comedy and was convinced that the power of laughter was so important. Now, obviously, there's a lot longer story here, and there's so much we don't know. My point is that there's a lot of gray area in medicine, and there's a lot we still don't know about this. And I think that there's a lot of power in the mind and the placebo, in our expectations, in our beliefs, in our understanding of our body, and in our relationship to our body, and how we perceive our food, and how we enjoy our movement. And so, I think it can be easy to gloss over things and kind of, we can be positive and sometimes neglectfully positive. I think there is a positive light where we can look at the power of our intention and how we approach these things that we do, even if we only have 20 minutes to practice yoga or 5 minutes to meditate, or, certain things in our refrigerator, that we can find ways to kind of shift the framework of how we see and utilize these tools, both around us and within us. And that's one of the reasons why I love yoga so much, is that, I don't have to go to the grocery store and buy the foods or the supplements or the doctors or the medicine. And again, it's not a cure-all, but it teaches me these innate tools that live inside of me, which is kind of everything we've talked about today.
It is. And to me, I feel the same way. This whole topic just motivates me to investigate myself more, however that looks like, be it the yoga practice or self-reflective practices in other forms. It's just a big motivation for me, knowing that there's other things that we don't know yet, and that also are very relevant. But the power of mind, the expectations that we have and we create for ourselves too, consciously or not, are so important in our daily experience of life. And it just motivates me to go down that path of self-investigation on so many levels. That's what I'm personally taking away from that whole topic.
And like a good researcher, I love that it's like the researcher's mindset to always be open, right? That like, there's so much we don't know. Even when we think we understand something, as a good scientist, that there's more studies coming. So I love that. And I'm so happy that we talked about this today. I feel like this has opened up a lot of great inquiry for our listeners. And thank you so much, Katja, for bringing all this information and the studies so that we could create some of those connections and hopefully, for those of you listening, inspire some of your own work. So investigate, be gentle on yourself, and find a way to appreciate the simple things that you can use and tap into to optimize your experience, your day, your connections and relationships, and ultimately just being in process in this experience. So thank you so much, Katja. We look forward to having another one with you.
And thanks everyone for tuning in.
And we will see you next time. Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you like the show, please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com, or check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine. You can also email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being a part of our Yoga Medicine community. We look forward to seeing you again. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.